So hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in tonight. This is the second event of the Assembly online series. Thanks for everyone who joined last week for the launch. The stream got taken down just before the end for copyright, as some of you all know. I don't think we'll get into that same problem this evening. But if there are any problems with the stream, just try refreshing your page, and it will normally log back in, and we'll wait a second and carry on. And if the stream gets taken down completely, which is very, very unlikely, then please resort back to the Assembly House Trust website, where and the Instagram will post a new link out. But I don't think that will happen tonight because it's original content. So without further ado, I'm going to try and pass over to Jonathan P. Watts and Emily Richardson, and Jonathan's going to introduce the films. So hopefully, here you go. Oh, okay.
One, two. 1, 2. Can you hear me? One, two. 1, 2. Okay, all right. This is very strange indeed. Great, okay, it seems to be working. Okay, I'm just going to mute various bits and bobs that needs to be muted. I'd just like to welcome you all to Of and By. This is the second in an ongoing series of artist talks, screenings and conversations hosted by the Assembly House in Norwich. The event has been organised in collaboration with Henry Jackson Newcomb, who has fairly recently been appointed Visual Arts Coordinator at the House. And as Visual Arts Coordinator, Henry is working to broaden the House's visual arts offering and really make it a destination in Norwich for contemporary art. Of and By, the series that I put together, doesn't really have a thematic design as such. In other words, it's not like it's a tightly programmed series in which I will develop a set of themes. I would say instead that what coheres the programme, however loosely, is that the work presented will have been produced in or explore in some way East Anglia. So, you know, I feel very strongly, as I know Henry does as well, that some of the most interesting and internationally relevant contemporary art is being produced in the region. So the series Of and By began probably about 4 months ago in what seems a different world now, pre-lockdown. And Simeon Barclay joined us, who is an artist based in the north of England, but Simeon, interestingly, was artist in residence at Girton College for the period of a year. And he produced new work whilst he was in residence. And he came to the Assembly House to discuss his experience of working in the college. This screening this evening of Emily Richardson's Houseworks has actually already happened before. It was programmed initially for the Whitechapel Gallery screening programme, which is curated by Gareth Evans, who I'm sure some of you will know. And for that screening, there was a poster pamphlet that you can see on the wall stuck behind me that was designed and produced by Lawrence Klingerbiel. If you're interested in getting a copy of this, perhaps there is some available. You might be able to contact Emily Richardson via Henry. Just let Henry know. So I'm going to just give something like an introduction to the trilogy of films. As some of you will already know, my name is Jonathan. I'm an art writer. I'm an occasional curator, as I like to say. But also for this evening, for this presentation, I'm also a collaborator. In 2012, I collaborated with Emily to research and write a script for a film that Emily wanted to make, which would become Three Church Walk, which we'll see tonight. And later it became a book that we worked on together with occasional papers called Ideas of Disorder, which was published in 2017. The first time I met Emily was in 2011, 9 years ago now, when I invited her into the Royal College of Art, where I was a student at the time. I invited Emily in to present a selection of films followed by a Q&A, a bit like what's happening this evening. And at the time, I really loved, and I still do love, in fact, her films Over the Horizon and Cobra Mist, which were both shot on Orford Ness, which was a former site of the Atomic Weapons Research Establishment in Suffolk. The shingle strip, Orford Ness, and Ness is a strip of land that comes out in parallel to the landmass, was used beginning in the early 20th century as a ballistics missile range. So you get this kind of this interesting tryst between kind of total destruction and conservation. Aerial photography was developed on the Ness. It was home to an early warning radar system that would later broadcast the BBC World Service. But it's also now a very significant conservation site, which is home to rare birds and flora and fauna, precisely because of this crumbling Cold War infrastructure that's on the site. The Ness, as many of you will know, tuned in at home, watching on YouTube, the Ness was made a literary tourist spot, really, by W.G. Sebald's Rings of Saturn. And Emily, in her films, got there before really a raft of other filmmakers, writers, and composers turned their attention to it. Just recently, Justin Barton and Mark Fisher's On Vanishing Land, which takes in the Ness, a journey from Felixstowe north along the coast, was published by Hyperdub, the record label. In Emily's films, I was particularly interested in the way that she collaborated with sound recordists and composers. So in those films on the Ness, she worked with Chris Watson, the famous sound recordist, and also with Benedict Drew, a contemporary artist, to produce this really extraordinary visual and oral evocation of the place. In a structural film tradition, the image comes first, which then functions something like a score for the sound that comes after, the composition of sound that comes after. So the sound is edited after the image. And Emily used in these films a military-grade anamorphic lens. She also used time-lapse. And there's this really compelling compression of the feeling of weather as a dynamic part of place. A year later, in 2012, I was able to spend more time. A year later, in 2012, Harry Bix is noting my change of costume. A year later, in 2012, I was able to spend more time with Emily in Suffolk at a short-lived arts festival at Aldeburgh Music, which some of you may know about, may have visited, which was curated by the artist Abigail Lane, which was called Snap. And although I lived in London at the time, I was born in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, and I spent a lot of time, and indeed I still spend a lot of time, although I live in Norwich now, hanging around East Anglia, just sort of lurking in Diss, or in Scrapby, or in West Kings Lynn. On this particular trip to Snap in 2012, the friend I was travelling with mentioned a house that he'd once stayed in Aldeburgh, that was designed by the architect H.T. Cadbury Brown and his partner Betty Dale. My friend couldn't remember where this house was, but he did recall that it was perhaps the worst night's sleep that he'd ever had in his life. He said that the beds were so modern and so uncompromising that he just couldn't sleep. And after some time, we found this house. It's completely overgrown. And interestingly, it was full of modernist furniture. And Emily and I talked about this house in 2012 at Snap and agreed that together we would return to what Emily described as being a modern ruin. It's interesting because in Britain at the time, this was really before the rise of things like the Modern House website, which obviously has kind of become an industry in itself, a kind of quasi intellectual discourse come estate agency. But at the time, there was kind of little attention given to modern domestic architecture, apart from organisations such as the 20th Century Society. And subsequently, Elaine Harwood has published a kind of monumental work, Space, Hope and Brutalism. But of course, this is a situation that's changed. This house, 3 Church Walk in Aldborough in Suffolk, provided an opportunity for Emily to continue her project of thinking not just about ruins, but also architectural space. Really a project that began earlier in a film such as Block, which takes as its subject the Tower Block, which is currently actually being either refurbished or demolished next to Bermondsey Park. Some of you will know it. Southwark Park, beg your pardon. But for me, this project was a way to continue my own research into a kind of wider ongoing interest in artistic modernism in East Anglia. This collaboration went merely beyond me supplying words for the final film. Emily and I carried out research together, we shared enthusiasms, we gave feedback and crits on edits of the films, and have subsequently regularly discussed one another's work. It's become a collaboration in the truest sense. And most recently, I assisted Emily Richardson on the production of the newest film, which is a short that was commissioned by the clothes designer Margaret Howell to commemorate 50 years of designing and producing clothes. And I'm sure we can put a URL up at the end of this if you're interested in seeing it. It's currently being hosted by the Nowness website. Jim Cadbury-Brown, who was the architect of 3 Church Walk, was a public voice in architecture, really. And our research into buildings and his writing led to a broader understanding of his attitudes to space, both internal and external, but also his attitudes towards the reproduction in photography of architecture, his attitudes towards the image, his attitudes towards the sound. These attitudes, interestingly, lent themselves to specific approaches that Emily then employed in shooting and editing 3 Church Walk. For Emily, this thinking of the relationship between architecture and film would be particularly generative. So in 2013, Emily began a practice-led PhD at the Royal College of Art that sought really to explore how modern architectural space has been represented in film, and also how our sense of place and our relationship to landscape is created through the medium of film, particularly artists' film and video. I actually still have that proposal that Emily put in for the PhD, and I was looking over it this afternoon. And it's interesting to note that the scope of this project initially took in places such as Park Hill in Sheffield, and also places like Bishopsfield in Harlow Newtown. And several buildings of the architect John Penn were on this list at this stage. John Penn, of course, is the subject of Beach House, the second film that we'll see this evening. John Penn was a Suffolk-born architect who, in the late 1950s, went over to California, to the West Coast, to work for Richard Neutra before returning to his native Suffolk. And in a period of 10 years, Penn designed 9 houses in a very, very small area of coastal East Suffolk, all of which, aside from one, followed an extremely rigorous plan. And the story goes that the only one that kind of falls outside of this plan is the first one, the starter, which was commissioned by Penn's mother, which is a slight kind of anomaly. Penn, intriguingly, for Emily, was an amateur filmmaker, so shot 8mm film, but also played in a free jazz group. Penn's Beach House, which is in Shingle Street in Suffolk, would become a subject of Emily's PhD, and also this film, as I've said, called Beach House. Emily's research for the PhD would lead her to Humphrey Spender's high-tech house in Essex, which was designed by Richard and Sue Rogers, which, interestingly, they would then subsequently seem, at least, to distance themselves from. So this house became the subject of the third film of modern houses in East Anglia, which is titled Spender House, the third film that we'll see this evening. Each film, in their own way, celebrates the houses, but also celebrates the bohemian lives that were lived in them during a period of experimentation in the 1960s that really tried to reimagine the very idea of a kind of modern vernacular for architecture. These films of Emily's reactivate spaces that have been lost to architectural history to some extent, and they do so by presenting what I would call a kind of counter-image, a counter-image to the clean, disembodied, often unpopulated optic of modernism. So that kind of rounds up my introduction to the films. I'm going to hand back over to Henry. I don't know if he can hear me. We'll see how this goes. After the screening, Emily and I will, by some kind of occult magic, reappear on your screens and we will have a conversation about the works. If you have any questions, the live chat is open and it will remain open. Well, it will close for the screening, but it will remain open during the conversation. So Emily and I will talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And if you have questions, feel free to type them in and we'll do our best to answer. That'd be great. Okay, all right, Emily, hello.
Okay.
Emily, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, that's fine now, that's clear. Okay, thank you. Emily, hello, thank you for providing the opportunity for us to present your films, the houseworks, the trilogy, as part of the Assembly House Trust programme, and in such strange circumstances during lockdown.
Yeah.
I feel that my entire life has become mediated by a screen and a camera attached to a screen. You're a filmmaker who comes from a structural filmmaking tradition, who works with celluloid film and has made films previously that are engaged with spaces of presenting films such as cinemas. I just have to ask, just to start, what is this an ideal screening condition? What is this experience like for you? How do you feel about showing the works?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting experiment, and I actually have to say that I feel like it's strangely apt, these particular films, showing them during kind of lockdown, where we're given a kind of window into other people's domestic space. We've all become probably a bit over familiar with our own, so I think it's fantastic to try and reach people during this kind of isolation period and connect in different ways, and this is one way of doing that.
I mean, I guess there's something about a kind of question of publicity and privacy, but maybe we could come back to that later on. We can return to this idea of publicity and privacy and the kind of putting on display the domestic space. I'm just going to sort of move on to a very broad question, just to really kind of open it up. It seems that there are three very different approaches in the films. The first one, there's a building that's very much seems to be in decay. It was a life that was lived there but has now vacated. And the second film really is bisected down the middle. There's the archival footage of then, and then there's the kind of then of the moment that you were filming, the present of the image when you were filming. There's also this relationship between the model of the house, which rotates on the potter's wheel in the archival film, and then the space where you're filming. And finally, this is a house that's very much lived in. And Spender says that he's concerned with texture, but he also talks about this idea of the close look and the distant view. And there's a sense of this kind of oscillating between the two. it's really interesting because there is this preoccupation of a kind of translating of architecture into a film, but you're always coming up against also the architect's own mediation of their own image, their own self-image, their own buildings as a kind of extension of their identity. Could you tell us a bit about your kind of approach to each of the films?
Yeah,
it's a big question, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they're all approached very particularly through a kind of research process and kind of looking at, not just the architecture, but the kind of biographies of the architects and inhabitants and how that plays out in the space, and how also how inhabitants have lived, how these spaces are very much lived spaces. So there's a play between the kind of, the sort of hard, dry kind of architectural intention, and then the way that these spaces are occupied in quite unconventional and perhaps sometimes quite radical ways. And I was really interested in kind of overcoming there's an overwhelming narrative of the kind of heroic aesthetic icon in modern architecture, and I was really interested in how these domestic spaces are, really don't adhere to those rules. And the way that I shot and the way I approached making the films was very much to try and kind of go behind that overwhelming kind of narrative of modernism, which we're kind of more, which we're fed more and more through this kind of aspirational kind of magazine type ideas of modernism. So, but each of the films, was approached through kind of research into the architects and the houses, and through talking to, if there were inhabitants, through talking to the inhabitants or the families, or people connected with the places. So that that's why each film, in a sense, has quite a different feel, because each one was approached individually, I suppose, in that way, and came out of the research process.
In Three Church Walk, it's quite a kind of mournful film in a sense. It's a kind of an elegy in a way, and there is a sense that you are stalking the building, emerging as an observer from the bushes to approach and enter the building. And but you also, there's a kind of combination of three shots, I suppose, to just kind of break it down: the static shot, the rotating shot, I don't know what you would call that, but also the handheld shot where you kind of walk through the space. Three very kind of distinct ways of shooting, but that have very specific effects and introduce movement and also a kind of sense of embodiment somehow. Could you talk to us a bit more about that? Because particularly in the first one, there's lots of sort of, it's a very sensual film. So maybe you could just tell us a bit more about your thinking.
Yeah, I mean, with Church Walk, I suppose I wanted to kind of recreate that experience of coming across the building in the way that it had been abandoned, obviously, for several years. So kind of peeking in through the windows and seeing that there were all these kind of personal kind of items left behind, like records stacked up and chairs and Anglepoise lamps and pictures on the walls. And there was also very much a sense of suspended time, because the house had been left untouched for about 3 years when we came across it. And so I like the idea of the handheld camera becoming like this kind of suspended time, because to shoot almost static shot with a handheld camera, you almost have to hold your breath to capture that shot. So there's constantly this sense of suspension almost in the image that just comes from the handheld camera being used in that way.
It's restless, it's twitching, and
yes, it's not locked off and fixed. Yeah.
We also hear your breath too.
Yeah, yeah.
Almost, we hear you sort of taking in breath, to hold your breath and then.
Yeah, I mean, what I found interesting watching them now is how similar, having done all these kind of Zoom chats and video calls that have been happening over the last few weeks, how actually the films that kind of reflect some of that in interesting ways, because now obviously with Zoom chat somebody walks off and then you kind of just see their room and then you might hear them in the background doing something about. So for me the film sort of took on a slightly different feeling actually watching them in this way under these circumstances. And I found them quite, obviously they're quite introspective in some ways, but I thought they kind of they sort of fit the circumstance in quite an interesting way.
Well, I suppose
that idea of like you hear the breathing and you hear the kind of the small sounds of the interior space, which now we're all so used to like zooming. But
yes, yeah. Well, I guess this. I mean, I guess this is the question about publicity and privacy. That one of the kind of aspects of the modernist aesthetic and ethic that Beatrice Colomina talks about is this kind of will to transparency in the Corbusier's buildings, and this moment of being sort of given access into people's domestic spaces is a kind of an opening up or an erosion of privacy in one sense.
Yeah, it's another opening, because I mean in modernism it was like the glass plate window kind of was this kind of view, this transparency that hadn't perhaps happened before because people had smaller windows with frames and and then of course there was a television which then was another window into the home, and obviously now we're kind of really experiencing this kind of another layer of transparency through this technology, I suppose.
The frame itself, the cinematic frame, the frame of the camera, the frame of the screen. I'm looking at you now through Zoom on whatever the aspect ratio is of that HD frame or whatever. The frame itself is very interesting because we have a sort of relationship between the cinematic frame and then the frame of the architecture, and that is really evident in the second film. Could you talk us? I mean, this is just to say that this is another way in which there is a parallel drawn between the filmic apparatus and the frame of the architecture. But I mean, it's really evident in the second film with John Penn. But I mean, maybe you could tell us a bit more about that, about how you see that relationship.
Yeah, I mean, well, all of the houses, because they're sort of single-story flat roof houses, have a kind of rectilinear sort of structure which mirrors the kind of 16:9 frame already, which is kind of a just a kind of direct kind of correlation. But with the second film with Beach House, it was particularly interesting because Penn himself was a filmmaker, and I came across, like, I was given this this film that he had made when Beach House was recently completed, and so that piece of archive film I used in its entirety in the film. I didn't cut it up. I didn't do anything with it because I thought it was really interesting as a way of showing his kind of interpretation of his filmic interpretation of the architectural space when it was completed. But even when he's drawing the plan on the wall of the plan of the house, it almost looks like the kind of title safe area that you get like in a camera viewfinder with crosshairs in the middle. And it was so sort of, there was such a strong correlation between this kind of between the film and the architecture in those ways too, which I found interesting. And I think the house itself is a kind of filmic narrative. It contains objects, memories. Sometimes, you know, the house itself is like a museum or archive. So there's a kind of, for me, there's always a very strong correlation between the sort of the filmic and the architecture.
Were you thinking of this idea of like the museum and the archive? I mean, each house and Spender House I lived in now, Three Church Walk wasn't at the time, but is now.
Yeah.
Were you thinking of them as archives or museums?
I mean, I thought what was interesting, I did sort of think of them as archives, but almost not as museums, because they were, what was interesting about them was that they hadn't been preserved in a kind of way that, say, Goldfinger's Goldfinger's house at Willow Road had been preserved in a kind of museumification kind of sense. It's like, you know, you can go there, you can visit, you can see how he lived in the house, but it's kind of a curated space, and it's you know, it's set out for you to experience in the same way as you might going to a museum. And what was interesting about these houses were they were kind of like archives, but without this kind of idea of museumification, because they hadn't been they sort of hadn't been curated in that way.
Yes.
But they were, you know, very rich in terms of their history and all the narratives that they contained.
Yeah. I'm interested in sound. I mean, obviously I have some insight into the way that sound operates in the first film. But obviously, you know, as I talked about in the introduction, you've worked with sound designers, sound recordists, in various ways throughout your work, in, you know, really compelling, really engaging ways. Could you talk to us a bit about how sound functions in the three works?
Yeah, I mean, in Church Walk, the sound was, you know, had a sort of connection with the house itself, in that the site had been earmarked for Benjamin Britten's first opera house for the Aldeburgh Music Festival, and Cadbury Brown had been asked to design this opera house, but it didn't take place, and that's how Cadbury Brown acquired the land to build Church Walk. But what was interesting was that his relationship with Benjamin Britten was, you know, was perhaps, I mean, Britten used things like car springs and teacups in some of his compositions, and there was this sense that perhaps Cadbury Brown had turned Britten into a brutalist, and this idea of like found sound had kind of, you know, come into
Noyes flood with the rain and the teacups.
Yeah, so I mean, with that film, I originally wanted to do some kind of like live score to the house, but that wasn't really feasible in terms of well, it was technically not particularly feasible. But what I did with Simon Limbrick was to record all the objects and surfaces and materials of the house, and to kind of compose a soundtrack where the house kind of became an instrument, really. And we played the house to make all of those sounds.
So the sound, so for instance, when in that kind of sunken area in Three Church Walk where the camera is rotating, there's a kind of clicking sound, and it's almost as if the sound is accenting the moving image. That's a sound that Simon Limbrick was playing in the house, is that right?
That's what he was recording. It was just like a piece of cardboard scraping along the tiles, so that you get this click every time you get a piece of grout, the cardboard would kind of click. And the other sounds that we recorded obviously were the angle poised lamps, which have a lovely musical sound, and the glass itself. You know, we took like a wet stick, and like you would kind of on a wine glass with, you know, your finger, you can create like a musical tone from the glass. So yeah, we did what's, you know, seemingly very simple kind of actions to create these distinctive musical sounds from the house.
Actually, I remember Simon Limbrick saying that he'd recorded, I mean, actually it's a very complex score. I remember him saying that he'd recorded and modelled the reverberations of each of the rooms, but then in the computer had been able to place specific sounds in different rooms.
Those spaces, yeah.
Right. So in other words, we're not, when we're seeing an image, we're not necessarily hearing the sound of something sounded in the room that we're seeing. There's a kind of complex play of
there's
a kind of acoustic space and cinematic space.
Yeah. There's some, you know, direct correlation between what you see and what you hear. But yes, it was very kind of complex recording situation.
The sound recording in Beach House, that's a gift. Where on earth did you find that?
That was interesting because during the research for the film, I came across an old colleague of Penn's who is still alive, and he lived in France, and I was having Skype meetings with him just to try and kind of find out more about Penn and about the house and about his houses. And he told me about this group, this Metaphonics group that Penn and he were both part of, where they met every couple of weeks and they would record, but they had an old kind of probably like a mono tape recorder. And this Cedric Green, his colleague, said to me, well, I think I've got some of those tapes somewhere. So I was like, well, I'd really like to hear them. So he was amazing. He dug them out and he found a selection of them and sent them to me. And so I used these recordings, which were really just kind of experimental, like improvised recordings that they were making. And I just took some of them and I kind of just basically layered them to create the soundtrack for Beach House. But it was nice because I read somewhere that Penn had wanted to use his experimental music in conjunction with his paintings, because he was also a painter and he had a gallery in London and would show paintings. And he'd always had this idea that he wanted to show the paintings with the music. So I thought, well, I can't do that, but it was I'm sure he would have approved to like see his kind of his architecture with the music. So I mean, that piece of archive film and those sound recordings were really, you know, they were really a gift in terms of making the film.
This question of approval and also this question of publicity and privacy, were you concerned to represent the houses in a way that was empathetic to the current owners who lived there?
That wasn't really I wasn't like, I suppose I didn't, not that I didn't consider that, but I think I just felt like I wasn't sure what they would think of the films, because I think, you know, I told them what I was doing, but they kind of, then they understood that I wasn't making kind of, you know, documentary or something that was a kind of, you know, a sort of straight portrait of the house. They were kind of a bit more experimental. But I mean, I think I haven't had any complaints anyway. So that's good.
I can see on the chat on the YouTube live stream that the Assembly has posted. If anyone would like to put forward a question, you're very welcome to go ahead and ask questions. I guess there will be a lag between me asking or just stating this and anybody posting questions. I'm very interested in the fact that there were these three extraordinary houses in East Anglia, and that they seem to be of a type. How do you account for that?
Yeah, I mean, they're kind of, they are a bit few and far between. And, I mean, I was really interested in when I found them, because there's not a lot of really interesting or really kind of radical rural modernism in East Anglia. I mean, there are, there's bits and pieces, as there are everywhere. But I mean, I found the houses really interesting because they weren't part of a kind of metropolitan idea of modernism. They were, these kind of perhaps these rural retreats, but quite. And they had each of the kind of owners or architects and makers. They had very unconventional, lifestyles. They were kind of, I suppose, they were quite radical for their time. And I think, it's a shame that that's not celebrated in terms of the architecture of East Anglia, because it's really interesting buildings and sort of often really tucked away. People that don't really know about them so much.
I mean, you're right. I mean, they don't seem to belong to a kind of cosmopolitan conversation about modernism, but they are retreats to some extent. I mean, True Church Walk obviously was a retreat for Cadbury Brown and Betty Page, who lived in London and then eventually moved full-time to Suffolk. We're also looking at privilege. We're also looking at wealth when we look at these houses.
Yeah, these are not, this is not social housing.
Right.
This is people who are experimenting with architecture, who have the money to do that. And although it's interesting now, because I think the Spender House was way over budget and it cost £12,000, I think, at the time, but that was way over budget. It was supposed to cost a lot less, and now, when you think about that, it just seems it doesn't seem like much, but 50 years ago, that was a considerable amount of money to be spending. To and these are people who anyone who has an architect design house is it's not something everyone can do, that's for sure.
No. It doesn't seem like there are any questions coming through on the YouTube chat, but we've been talking for half an hour. If there are no questions from the stream, I could ask one more question and then maybe we could leave it at that.
Yeah.
Does that sound all right to you?
That sounds good.
Oh, hang on. I've got a question. Rosie Hyam Stainton, Cow Hill. Emily, could you talk about horizontality within spaces / film, please?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose by the nature of the plan and elevation of all of these houses, there is a kind of horizontality to them. They're all, because of the single, because they are these single story, flat roof buildings, and also because of the kind of openness, I suppose, of the interiors, they do have a kind of horizontality to them. And particularly Beach House reflects that horizon in the landscape, where it sits right on the beach, and you have this I liked the way that the crittle windows in that house kind of line up with the horizon of the sea a lot of the time, and there's kind of these parallels between the kind of rectilinear insets of the windows, kind of reflecting the film frame and also the kind of horizon outside. So I mean, it's I don't know if there's what else to say about it, but there is certainly I think because the houses themselves reflect that, they're kind of almost like a landscape themselves in their format, in the way that they're built, their shape, and so they do have that sense of horizontality.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very interesting also that the genre of landscape as it developed in painting is oriented around the landscape aspect as opposed to the portrait aspect or the vertical aspect.
Yeah.
And I'm saying aspect and horizon. You've made a film called Aspect. You made a film called Over the Horizon.
Yeah, there you go.
And so the idea of the horizon, like where land meets sky, is something that is in the distance, that is not proximate to us. And yet landscape, as it's developed within European culture, is this thing that is developed around a view and the landscape orientation of the frame, when in fact, as so many of your films teach us, we are in the landscape. Landscape is the weather around us, and actually the separation between land and sky is actually kind of a myth, really. It's a construct. It's a pictorial construct. We've got some more questions here. They're coming in thick and fast now. Peter Nencini of Norwich is saying, Emily, did you spend a period of time in each house before you filmed? Thank you for an excellent screening.
No, thank you. I always spend quite a lot of time with each place that I make a film. I mean, often it takes me about a year to make a film, which seems like a very long time for like a 10-minute film, but I do tend to spend a lot of time in a place, doing a lot of research, taking a lot of photographs, just returning. And so each of the films was made probably over the period of about a year each, I suppose. And that tends to be the way I work. I spend, about a year usually making a single film.
Thank you. Connor Delahunty is asking an interesting question here. Has the emergence of things like the modern house made you rethink these films and the films that you might want to make in the future? Does it make it harder?
I think, it's interesting, the modern house. So they approached me actually when I'd made these films, and they said, oh, we really want to show them, but that was before they'd seen them. And
what happened when they saw them?
Because they're like, well, it's not really them, it's not really quite like the modern house. So yeah, I think the modern house is, like, in a sense, the most public or the most known manifestation of this kind of rise of populism of modern architecture. But having spent quite a long time making these films, and I could see that happening in lots of places, in lots of different ways. And I think, I was kind of very mindful to make work that didn't fit with a kind of estate agent's view of modernism. And Spender House is a case in point, because it's so inhabited that you can hardly see the architecture anymore. And I'm sure Rogers would have been horrified had he sort of seen how the space was occupied, because it probably didn't conform with the way that it was supposed to be lived in. So, whether it makes it more difficult or I would change what I do now, I think having made these films, I don't think I'm going to make any more films about modern houses, because I spent a long time, and this was all part of a PhD project as well. So I'm kind of moving on from that. But yeah, I suppose the circumstances and the time in which you make films reflect is reflected in the films themselves. And now, if I were to make them, I would, in a sense, probably have to really have to look at that context again, and would see it differently.
We've just got a couple of comments just to finish up. Claire Palmier of Saxmundham is saying an observation, really, the reflection of the landscape. The shoreline on the oven door in the Penn Beach House was very beautiful. Harry Bix is saying horizontality in Norfolk ?
Oh yeah,
I mean,
there's plenty of it there, isn't there?
that's everywhere, isn't it?
Yeah, it must be the most horizontal county, isn't it?
But I think the interesting thing for me is this connection between Penn, as somebody who was in California, who then moved back to Suffolk and was very much, not just influenced in his interest in jazz music by American soldiers who were stationed in the air bases around Suffolk, but it was also, was influenced by Neutra, worked for Neutra, built these kinds of, supposedly kind of sort of economical project houses after the Second World War, but they became very glamorous houses in the hills around Los Angeles. So there's a really, really compelling relationship between the west coast of California and and the coast of Norfolk and Suffolk.
Yeah, I mean, Penn's houses are like sort of Californian modernisms, planted into the kind of the Suffolk coastline, which is, I found that really wonderful, actually. I'm like, I think it's a shame there isn't more of it.
Okay, well, look, we're coming up to 9:10. I just, perhaps we could leave it here. Thank you very much, Emily Richardson, for taking the time in the non-time of isolation time, for joining us on Zoom. Other platforms are available, and for allowing us to stream your wonderful trilogy of films called Houseworks on YouTube. Other platforms are available. And also thank you to the Assembly House Trust, Henry Jackson Newcomb, and also those of you on the chat. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks everybody for coming. It's been really good.
Yeah, and if people want to get hold of the Houseworks leaflet, poster, are there any available?
Yeah, there's some available. Just drop me an email, and if you go to my website, my email's there, and I'll send you one.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Time for tea.
Yeah.
Hello, so I should be back online now, hopefully. I'm just going to check I'm coming through. It's a 20-second lag, so it takes a minute. Okay, yeah, I'm back online. To close, really, thank you firstly to Emily and Jonathan for the films and that interesting discussion. I'd like to announce just a few details on the next few events, just so that people know what's coming up in the next few weeks. Next Thursday, April the 16th, we've got Home Sounds, which will be a sound walk and discussion with Martin Scaife and Oliver Payne on listening and well-being. Home Sounds is a project that has a series of fixed microphones around Norfolk locations. They're binaural microphones, they're on all the time, 24-hour streams, and they're used for various sound and nature-based activities. On the April 23rd, we have a critical reading discussion with Philippa Snow and Roseheim Staten. They'll be reading from and discussing Heroines by Kate Sabrenner. It's a manifesto for toxic girls that reclaims the wives and mistresses of modernism for literature and feminism. If you would like to read the text in advance or read along during the event, you can find a copy in the link on our website. If you go to assemblyhousetrust.org.uk, I'll post the link in the bio. And yeah, you can download a copy of the ebook. Audiences will be able to post questions to Rose and Philip during the chat. Sorry, I dropped my headphones. And on the 30th of April, it'll be a Poetry Readings live event hosted by Clay Draper with 4 guests to be announced. And then, yeah, then on to me. But